August 2nd, and Putin has had a heart attack. A nuclear base in Kamchatka has been destroyed by a tsunami. At this very moment, a massive tsunami is wiping out Russia's nuclear submarine base in Kamchatka.
What?
The attack on the nuclear triad has begun. Satellites have recorded damage at the military pier where Borei-class submarines are based. These are nuclear warhead carriers, the ones closest to the US. Russia is losing its nuclear shield. The nuclear submarine base was swept away by the wave. At the same time, there's a series of strikes on the railway.
Trains burning real good.
Panic in Taganrog and Penza, a fire at the radio factory, and explosions in Crimea.
This is fucked.
The Ukrainian Armed Forces are attacking logistics and Russia is losing control. What's happening with the nuclear fleet, and why are even the submarine forces becoming vulnerable? No, seriously friends, it's August 2nd and a massive tsunami has wiped out Russia's nuclear submarine base in Kamchatka. Satellites have recorded damage at the military pier where a Borei-class submarine is based. These are carriers of nuclear warheads, the closest ones to the United States of America. This is a sensational and unprecedented event. Russia is losing its nuclear shield. The nuclear submarine base was swept away by the wave. Satellites are recording the damage. If the infrastructure there is indeed compromised, an entire line of nuclear deterrence in the Pacific is at risk. At the same time, the Ukrainian Armed Forces are striking the rear. Moscow, the Moscow region, and St. Petersburg. A radio factory in Penza burned down, railways were cut in the Rostov and Moscow regions, and in Crimea there are explosions and panic. We are witnessing the beginning of a systematic campaign. The strikes are targeting the most vulnerable points. What is happening to the Russian nuclear fleet, and why are even submarines now becoming vulnerable? Russia is losing its nuclear shield. It is under a barrage of strikes. These are no longer chaotic attacks. This is a clear, systematic campaign to destroy supply lines, communications, and the nuclear triad. Bridges, railways, radio factories, traction substations, logistics hubs. At the same time, the Pentagon is ordering missiles worth $3 to $5 billion for Ukraine. And Germany is providing us with new Patriots. Even Trump acknowledges Russia's terrorist actions. This is a disgrace. What is this? Is this the beginning of a complete logistical collapse of the Russian armed forces? We're discussing this right now with top analyst Roman Svaitin.
Greetings, and I wish everyone good health.
Roman Grigorievich, a tsunami damaged the pier at the nuclear submarine base in Rybachi, that's in Kamchatka. Satellites have recorded a shift in the structures. This is the base for the Boreis and Deltas, the closest one to the US. What risks does Russia face after the submarine base in Rybachi was damaged? Does this weaken Russia's nuclear triad?
Well, definitely one of the main mechanisms for launching Russia's nuclear weapons is submarines. Any base that is put out of commission, by the way, including the one in Crimea, there was a base there at one time as well. Why did the Russians cling to Crimea and refuse to give it up? There was a submarine base there. Now we've driven them out. In Novorossiysk, they never really managed to build a proper base. And Feodosia 13, that's a nuclear facility in Crimea. They never managed to launch it. No brains, no money. Planet Shelezyaka, no water, no mineral resources, inhabited by robots. That's pretty much like Russia. In other words, they couldn't get almost anything up and running, so the remaining bases are very important to them. But most likely, this was the work of our heavenly office and the prayers of our believers from various faiths, who called down thunder on the heads of the Russian military. One of the ways to do this is to give a good shake to the places where the submarine bases are located. And that's exactly what happened. We saw it. And in general, a big thank you to the Heavenly Office and to those who prayed.
Roman Grigorievich, in general, is it even possible for Russia's nuclear triad to be under threat? When we talk about Russia's strategic aviation airfields, nuclear submarines, the Pacific and Northern fleets, are we really talking about attacks on the nuclear triad?
Well, it's called a triad precisely because there are several, at least, mechanisms for delivering nuclear warheads. Submarines, the so-called naval fleet of various types, including both ships and submarines, as well as aviation, long-range strategic bombers, missile carriers. Well, naturally, there are also ground-based launchers, both silo-based and mobile ones, which the Russians have plenty of in this regard, although their new missiles never really make it off the drawing board. With the Sarmat, nothing at all has happened. They made a fuss about the Oreshnik, as they say, but then forgot about it and went quiet. So, by and large, the Russians don't really have any development to speak of, and basically they're mostly just using the mechanisms left over from the Soviet Union. These systems, through various means, including acts of God, are of course gradually failing. So one of the mechanisms is simply the aging of the equipment itself, and also various disasters, including earthquakes like the one in Kamchatka. So they are definitely experiencing losses. In other words, Russia's nuclear potential is decreasing. It seems that the total number of nuclear warheads isn't going down. There's a really significant and pressing question about their ongoing restoration efforts, because a nuclear warhead literally needs to be completely remanufactured every approximately 30 years, since there's a certain inherent and unavoidable decay process that occurs over time. So they absolutely need to be constantly and meticulously remanufactured, which the Russians are currently not doing at all. That's why there's still a big question regarding the nuclear triad, specifically about the actual number of nuclear warheads ready for use. The Russians are not in a very good position in this area.
Dear audience, please like this video, give a like to our duet with Roman Grigorievich, and write a few kind words in the comments to support Ukraine. Tell us where you're watching from, and share your thoughts on the tsunami and the attacks on Russia's nuclear triad. This is truly very important. Then now we move on to the actions of the armed forces of Ukraine. The Ukrainian Armed Forces carry out pinpoint strikes on railway logistics in the Rostov and Volgograd regions. Salsk, Kotelnikovo, Kanalnoye. Traction substations, fuel trains, and electrical control posts were damaged. What's going on, Roman Grigorievich? Are we methodically destroying the enemy's railway hubs and logistics?
Well, over the past week, you can literally see the systematic nature of the work now. At first, when they initially started hitting some Russian traction substations and railway infrastructure, it seemed a bit scattered and somewhat disorganized, and it wasn't entirely clear what the ultimate goal or objective truly was. But now, after a week of daily strikes on railway hubs, power plants, that is, on balancing energy capacities, and on traction substations, it's become clear. Now it's clear that they're practically trying to paralyze things. And of course, these aren't the last strikes naturally. Our forces are trying to do this with long-range strike capabilities. Mainly, these are our fierce An-196. That's Antonov. Production was funded for us, about 400 million euros for their manufacturing. Germany, by the way, thank you very much. Direct payment on the level of the so-called Danish initiative, when the Danes raised money and paid directly and continue to pay directly to the manufacturers of the Bogdana self-propelled artillery systems. So in much the same way, these An-196 are now being produced with German funding and are carrying out combat missions in large numbers. You can see the systematic approach now. So at this point, you could say that the direction toward Rostov and toward Taman has basically been neutralized. This is the main railway line that supplies. Right now, the Russians are trying to transfer the reserves they had gathered for the second wave of the summer offensive. And this systematic work on these hubs gives us at least some hope that we can stop the movement of Russian troops deep in the rear. And it's not just equipment, but also fuel. Although, as we've discussed many times, the optimal way to deal with fuel is to destroy oil refineries, but so far our authorities have not allowed our generals to do this.
Roman Grigorievich, can we now really talk about a large-scale campaign by the Ukrainian Armed Forces to destroy the logistics of the Russian Armed Forces, specifically through the railways? Can we predict that these actions will intensify?
Well, definitely the direction chosen is the right one. This is systematic work, planned work. One could even say it's already become routine in this direction. In the Rostov direction, they found ways to overcome the frontal air defense in Donbass. The Russians have been building it up there for more than 10 years. It really is dense, but nevertheless, they found a way. They found opportunities and mechanisms to break through it. And after that, combat drones carry out the main task. In other words, the Lyuti can reach quite far, 600, 700 kilometers for this drone. Now, especially new modifications of drones with new warheads that can perform combat missions of different levels. That is, this systemic nature makes it possible to shut down Russian logistics in this direction until they at least switch to some other mechanisms.
Let's move on to occupied Crimea. Feodosia, Crimea. A series of night explosions. Air defense was in operation. There was panic among the locals. Here is the Crimean Wind Telegram channel, which reported that Crimea was shaking from explosions last night. Question: is the attack on Crimea a preparation for a new offensive by the Ukrainian Armed Forces to occupy the peninsula?
Well, for now, it truly looks like the Crimean Peninsula is being extensively used as a kind of Chornobaivka, I would confidently say, based on the regular and consistent destruction of Russian radar and anti-aircraft missile systems, and exclusively those specific systems. You can accurately predict and generally analyze that this is indeed the primary objective. In other words, a wave comes in. You remember, we talk about this in waves. About once a month, a wave hits Crimea and wipes out almost all of Crimea's air defense. A wave of our drones comes in, takes out all the air defenses, and that's it. Then we sit and wait until they bring more air defense systems back to Crimea. We wait for the next wave. They bring them in again, set them up. Our Atesh guys, the main Directorate of Intelligence and the Security Services Counterintelligence, our partners, have mapped out the locations of the Russian radio technical troops' radars. And then the second wave comes in and wipes them out again. Again, we wait sitting until they bring them in once more. And the most interesting thing is, where do they get them from? They have, so to speak, a patchwork cloak. They take from somewhere when somewhere else loses out. That is, they're bringing all this in from the main territory of Russia. And now in this kind of Kornobaivka mode, Crimea is being used as a staging ground for destroying Russian air defenses. So when it starts, when once again, after another wave of destruction of Russian air defenses leads to the point where the Russians have nothing left to bring in, that means they simply have nothing left to supply. After that, it will be possible to start working on liberating Crimea, beginning directly with achieving air superiority and then continuing to strike military targets. They're not going anywhere. The stationary military facilities, you know, the 150th, they've been there since Soviet times, dug in and reinforced with concrete. They're not going anywhere after that either. Once the Russians run out of surface-to-air missile systems, then it will be possible to hit Crimea with serious missiles. By that time, I think our repainted Tarasiks, the Tauruses, will have arrived. And then there will be enough range, enough distance to operate directly over Crimea, including the Kerch Bridge.
Roman Grigorievich, Penza. The drone strike by the SBU on the radio factory, which produces communications equipment for the enemy's armed forces, has been confirmed. At least 12 explosions, warehouses, and a new production building are on fire. Why Penza today? Is this a critical target? And what does a strike on the radio factory mean?
Well, it feels like only the SBU is listening to us. Well, that's because in reality, only the SBU is doing things the right way from an aviation standpoint. We've said it so many times, there's no need to strike every time if you don't have enough drones or a proper target. First, you need to reconfirm the target, gather a sufficient number of drones, and direct them all at a single point. And then you can eliminate that point. Only the SBU operates this way. I don't know who they have over there. Most likely there's a pilot involved somewhere nearby helping to organize all this. Or maybe they just listen to us very often and their analysts take notes and pass them up to Maliuk. A big shout out to him in that regard. That's the right approach. They gather information like this once a week, maybe once every 10 days. The SBU guys gather a sufficient number of drones, collect enough decoy drones, select a target for themselves. That is, they identify it, map out the route, conduct additional reconnaissance on the target, determine the exact coordinates, and then, by making a direct push to a single point, they break through the frontal air defense. Yes, the Russians shot down some of the decoy drones there. Well, those are just flying boards, which are specifically needed so that the Russian air defense reacts to them. Meanwhile, our strike drones got through. Strike drones reached Penza, that's hundreds of kilometers away. They reached Penza and took out the radio factory, one of the main ones, which also produces control systems for those same missiles. So that's the right approach. Well, let's put it this way. The rest of you learn from Malyak, after all. Well, buy him a bottle of vodka, have a drink with him, and he'll tell you what Svitan and Dasha have been saying for the second or third month already.
Friends, please support Roman Grigorievich's statement. It's very important. Like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Roman Grigorievich, what happened in Taganrog? Because there were more than 12 explosions, kamikaze drones, a nighttime air raid alert, and widespread complaints about the performance of the local Russian air defense. And I think even one air defense missile hit a Russian's bathhouse. This was reported by locals. What do you think?
Well, they're listening to us too. We always say that someone should pay a visit to the Rubliovka bathhouses, you know, check the temperature of the boilers there. And most likely some of the Russian air defense guys wanted to see what's going on in the bathhouses in Rostov now, including those in Taganrog. After all, that's all part of the same network. In Taganrog, it's actually quite an extensive area. There are several factories there. It's a large zone for the production of aviation weapons. And that includes everything from drones to airplanes. They even hit the Borei plant there, by the way. At one time, they even made the B-12 there. That is, these were planes that could land on and take off from water. So it's quite an extensive aviation manufacturing area. Almost the whole of Taganrog is involved. And again, following the same pattern we talked about, it's just a little over 100 kilometers to Taganrog. You don't need to fly 500 or 700 kilometers. Then almost all of our operational strategic level drones can reach Taganrog. And naturally, as soon as there are enough of them, they go out there and carry out their combat missions, just like this time. Over the course of several days, probably about a week and a half, our drones hit Taganrog several times, striking at Russian production. Moreover, some Russian drones, even those of the Geran type, which are known for their specific design and operational capabilities, are meticulously assembled, including specifically at the Taganrog factories, utilizing the extensive facilities of various aviation enterprises and industrial complexes. There in Taganrog, at the aviation plant, the same Tu-95s, they have been modernized to launch Kh-101 missiles. All of this is happening right there, all in Taganrog. That's why, naturally, it's the right approach. And I'll say it again, you can clearly see the systematic nature of this approach. The only thing needed is concentration, not scattershot attacks, but rather learn from Malyuk.
Russia has begun constructing concrete dome shelters at airfields in Crimea, Kursk, and Milarovo. This is according to official data from the UK Ministry of Defense. Why has Russia only now started building shelters at its airfields? Is this a sign of panic, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, the crucial thing is these substantial fortifications themselves of this particular level are in principle a quite good target for, say, powerful missiles, but they primarily serve as effective protection from incoming drones. And so, realizing that we are unlikely to have missiles in the near future, the Russians are starting to understand that missiles obviously won't be launched at these shelters since we don't have any. Don't believe those announcers of ours from Bankova. Over there, it's basically one announcer after another just announcing things. But in reality, it's because there's no other reason. The thing is, any shelter, even a concrete one, is not really a shelter against a bunker-busting warhead. On the contrary, it's actually a good target. So clearly, if half a ton drops onto the dome, everything underneath it is done for planes, aviation equipment, airfield technical gear, Russian federal troops who are there. In other words, it's a good target. But they can protect themselves from drones, especially not necessarily from a direct drone strike, but at least from drone shrapnel. Because now the Russians, realizing that all those announcers sitting on Bankova are just telling fairy tales, have started building at least dome-shaped concrete shelters. Well, I think in the end, let them build them. And then with the Germans, it's clear that ours can only blabber on. We'll have to negotiate with the Germans, and we've already talked about our Tarasiks, those repainted Taurus missiles. I think those domes, they'll get a good look at them there.
Jet-powered Shahed. Russia is using new drones with turbojet engines, reaching speeds of up to 600 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 9 kilometers, and they're hard to intercept. Roman Grigorievich, how serious is this threat? Is Ukraine prepared for the mass use of such jet-powered Shaheds?
Jet-powered Geran, let me correct you, it's not a jet-powered Shahed. If it were a jet-powered Shahed, it wouldn't be a big deal. There aren't many of them. Specifically the Iranian ones, but as for the Chinese jet-powered Gerans, there could be a lot of them. This is the problem we've been discussing with you for a whole year. So it's not Shaheds that are flying towards us. Let me repeat, if it were Shaheds, there would only be dozens of them because they simply couldn't and wouldn't be able to produce more than that. But when China directly got involved in the production of components, assemblies, and large-scale assembly, when Chinese engineers set up certain production lines already on Russian territory, expanded the factories and enlarged them several times over in Ijevsk and also in Alabuga. After that, naturally, hundreds of Gerans started flying. And our leadership was not prepared for these hundreds of Gerans because they had been told over and over that these were Shaheds flying. And as soon as the Israelis destroy the Shahed factories in Iran, everything will stop. Everything will stop. But nothing stopped because there haven't been any Shaheds there for a long time. So these are Gerans, Russian, Chinese Gerans, hundreds of Gerans with internal combustion engines are already coming to us. We can already see it. The same thing will happen. First dozens, then hundreds of Geran 3s with Chinese turbines will start coming in as well. The question is, a Geran of this level is basically already a cruise missile. Its speed is basically about the same. That is, if a missile travels at 700, 800, or 900 kilometers per hour, then such a Shahed, well, I'm already calling it a Shahed myself, such a Geran can travel at speeds from 500 to 700. In other words, its turbine can accelerate it. The same goes for altitude. Yes, a cruise missile can climb up to and even beyond 10 kilometers. But such a Geran can climb up to 5 kilometers, meaning it can get past the frontline air defense or at the very least evade our mobile groups, machine guns, anti-aircraft guns, and manpads. After all, manpads can't reach above 5 kilometers. That's why at this point, we already need to start preparing for a large number of Russian-Chinese jet-powered Garans. How do we prepare? We need to reinforce the frontline air defense and not just with interceptor drones, because those mainly work against piston engine drones. That is the second generation Gerans, the slow, low flying ones. Now we need to strengthen it with missiles. In other words, the only way to intercept a third generation jet-powered Geran is with a missile, either one launched from a ground-based air defense system or from an aircraft. That's why it's very important for us right now to find ways to start producing these missiles in sufficient quantities. This is possible. That is, we have this opportunity together with our partners. There are plenty of inexpensive missiles, especially since they're being used against a non-maneuvering target. It's not like an aircraft, for example, which can perform an anti-missile maneuver when a missile is approaching. So in this case, for the same tens of thousands of dollars, you can create a missile, an anti-missile against a jet-powered Geran, and in fact also dry up the Russian economy with this approach, because a jet-powered Geran costs about twice as much as a regular Geran with an internal combustion engine. There are mechanisms. The issue is funding, setting the task, technical specifications, and so on and so forth. But knowing how our leadership only announces ballistic missiles, which we've been talking about for so long, if they make the same kinds of announcements about anti-missiles, then what awaits us ahead is, well, hundreds of these jet-powered Garans. It will be quite difficult to shoot them down, because right now, at this moment, not just difficult in principle, this jet-powered Geran is more visible, for example, in the thermal spectrum. On the one hand, it will draw out our extremely expensive missiles, the ones we have, which cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Realizing that in this ratio, the third jet-powered Geran will be more cost-effective, the Russians, together with the Chinese, will now start churning them out by the hundreds like hotcakes. So we might not have enough missiles to shoot them down, especially the expensive ones.
Yes, the new drone is capable of covering up to 2,500 kilometers and flying at an altitude of up to 9 kilometers. This means that only surface-to-air missile systems can shoot it down, and that's very expensive. So Ukraine is forced to use expensive missiles costing millions of dollars to intercept these targets. Is that correct, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, let's put it a bit more accurately. First of all, not only surface-to-air missile systems, but also fighter jets. Well, basically, a fighter jet is essentially the same as a surface-to-air missile system. I mean, they both have radars. So in this context, really, it's either a ground-based SAM or a fighter jet. That's one point. And secondly, the missiles don't cost millions of dollars, but they do cost hundreds of thousands, like $100,000, $200,000, $300,000. The missiles that can currently be used against these Geran 3 drones are quite expensive. That's why I'm saying we need to develop a missile that's not so expensive. First of all, half the functions of a missile designed to chase after an aircraft aren't needed here. Why? Because you don't really need to chase after a Geran. It's not a maneuvering target. So in this sense, it's much easier. That's why we can make it cheaper. In other words, make a missile that's less expensive than the Geran itself. And in that case, if you scale up production even further, then in principle, you could use these missiles to shoot down not only the original Geran drones, but also the piston engine Geran models, the second generation, the so-called slow-moving ones. Here, it's a matter of cost. And as soon as we reach a certain figure where our production becomes cheaper than the Russian-Chinese Geran drones, believe me, the Russians themselves, together with the Chinese, will reduce their production because it will no longer be profitable for them.
Roman Grigorievich, when we talk about, for example, interceptor drones, can this be an effective and very cheap countermeasure against the new drones?
Definitely not against the new ones. The thing is, an interceptor drone, even if it accelerates to the speed of a third generation Geran with a turbojet engine with a turbine, it simply won't catch up to it. Well, you could try to hit it from the front hemisphere, but that's very difficult. You could easily miss. And if you're chasing it, you simply won't catch up. That's why interceptor drones in this sense will be absolutely ineffective against the third generation Gerans. An interceptor drone is effective against internal combustion engines, meaning the second generation Gerans with internal combustion engines. Again, in terms of effectiveness at the moment, it's just that we haven't yet deployed, for example, light aircraft, because light aircraft would actually be even more effective than interceptor drones. But this needs to be a comprehensive approach. We need to have everything. We need to have mobile groups on the front line, mobile groups that at the very least have access to machine guns, anti-aircraft guns, and high-altitude anti-aircraft guns. We have anti-aircraft guns that can operate at ranges from 4 to 8 kilometers. There should also be man-pads with a range of up to 5 kilometers, which work very reliably. Man-portable air defense systems like the Stinger. There should be interceptor drones as well. In other words, a mobile group is still necessary. But all of this should be part of the core, as part of the core air defense brigade. So this is army-level air defense. And here we also need to deploy not just man-pads, but short-range surface-to-air missile systems with infrared homing warheads, which will be able to target, among other things, jet-powered Garand drones, and essentially prevent any number of Russian Garands from entering our territory. So this kind of layered system of strike assets for the brigades within the core will make it possible to strengthen the frontline air defense. And whatever manages to break through into our territory can then be dealt with by long-range surface-to-air missile systems, building a multi-layered defense, helicopters up to 1 kilometer from 1 to 3 kilometers, light aircraft, light aviation, even up to 4 kilometers, and from 4 kilometers and above, fighter jets. Here you have the mechanism, that is the system that needs to be built. But now, at this moment, you can already see preparations for building this system. Magyar has taken on air defense directly. So that's correct. That's the right approach. This is exactly his task. This is frontline air defense, and light aircraft are getting ready to take off. There are already orders, and now the whole process has begun. In the next 1.5, 2, maybe 3 months, we might already see the effect.
Roman Grigorievich, the US has signed a contract worth $3.5 billion for the production of AMRAAM missiles, including for Ukraine. Germany is transferring 2 more Patriot systems to Ukraine and will receive new ones from the US in return. So AMRAAM missiles have a target engagement range of over 100 kilometers for aircraft and 20 to 40 kilometers for NASAMS. Their effectiveness is up to 85%. How will the delivery of new missiles and new Patriot systems change Ukraine's air defense strategy?
Well, only the quantity will change. That is, the strategy won't change. They will continue to be used in the same way. What is an AM-120 missile? The AM-120 is the main NATO missile, a missile used by fighter jets like the F-16. This is the primary missile with which the F-16 shoots down cruise missiles and aerial targets, only aerial targets. It does not work against ballistic missiles. And we have exactly the same missile. It has been adapted for ground use and is also used at ranges up to 40 kilometers, making NASAMS a medium-range surface-to-air missile system. This is roughly the same as the IRIS-T. That is, it's the same IRIS-T missile that is used in the IRIS-T SLM-SLS surface-to-air missile system. An air-to-air missile is a decent start, yes, but it's just a start. The thing is, well, even if they produce several 100,000 missiles, different missiles are built differently. Right now, we're mainly using missiles with a range of 70 to 80 kilometers, but what we need are missiles with a range of 120 to 160 kilometers or even more. There are missiles like the AM-120TE that go beyond 160 up to 180 kilometers. But for that, we need F-16 aircraft with advanced avionics, with radars that can at least operate at 200 kilometers, or airborne radars that, using the Link 16 tactical data transmission system, could control and provide targeting for the same missile launched from an F-16. In other words, this is an entire set of tasks which, in principle, if there are enough of these missiles, they will certainly accomplish. But they are expensive. This is a very expensive missile, and it should ideally be used against cruise missiles and, of course, against aircraft, specifically Russian aircraft and cruise missiles. And if, for example, those same jet-powered Gerands break through, then there is still some sense in using it. But in reality, of course, it would be better not to use it against Gerands. It's just too expensive. The price ratio is about an order of magnitude, roughly 10 times. That's why, specifically against jet-powered Gerands, it's much better to use much cheaper missiles, either the Stinger manpads or the RIM-162 ESSM or the AIM-9 AMRAAM, which costs about 3 times less than the AM-120. So you have to choose the right ratio, but that's exactly what the Air Force is responsible for. The Air Force, which is involved in all these air defense processes.
Dear audience, please like this video and in the comments write a few kind words in support of the armed forces of Ukraine. Let us know where you're watching from, what city, what country. Roman Hryhorovich and I are working for an audience all over the world so that people know the truth about Russian aggression and Russia's war against Ukraine, and so that as many people as possible support Ukraine. That's why every like, comment, and subscription from you is invaluable. The well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Hryhorovich, thank you very much, and see you this Monday.
Goodbye.